I'm Lauren Hartley, 34 years old, and I used to believe that if I worked hard, stayed kind, and kept showing up for my family, I'd earn something solid. A place. A little peace. Maybe even a porch to sit on with coffee that didn't taste like guilt. But on a Tuesday morning in early spring, I opened an envelope that said otherwise. My parents Gregory and Sandra had filed a lawsuit against me. For what? For the 3-bedroom house I bought after 12 years as a trauma nurse. They claimed I owed it to my younger sister Olivia, who hasn't worked a full-time job since her 20s. They said it was only fair that I had more and she had less. That sharing was the moral thing to do. But they weren't sharing anything. They were taking. From the daughter who once skipped her own birthday dinner to drive Olivia to therapy. From the woman who ate peanut butter sandwiches for 5 years to save enough for a down payment. That day I realized the people who raised me didn't see me as family anymore. They saw me as leverage. And I stopped asking why. It was a Tuesday morning and the sun had just reached the porch when I heard the soft thud on the welcome mat. I figured it was a package. Maybe the light bulbs I ordered or that dog toy for my neighbor's golden retriever. But when I opened the door, it wasn't a box. It was a thick envelope from a law office in Milwaukee with my full name Lauren Hartley printed in bold black letters. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I stood there, barefoot, sun on my shoulders, flipping the thing over like it might explain itself. Then I tore it open and read the first line. Notice of civil complaint. Gregory and Sandra Hartley v. Lauren Hartley. I had to sit down. Right there on the steps. My parents were suing me. For the house I bought. The house I saved for over a decade to afford. The house I walked through alone in the rain with a realtor who smelled like peppermint. The house where I painted every wall myself because I couldn't afford contractors. The house I now apparently owed to someone else. Not just someone else. Olivia. My sister. My jobless, charming, chaos-stirring younger sister. The complaint claimed I had violated a long-standing verbal agreement to provide shared housing for Olivia. It stated that because she lacked the means to support herself and I had stable employment and a mortgage in my name, it was only fair that she be allowed to live here indefinitely. The wording made it sound almost noble. As if this were a sacrifice I was meant to make. As if my home had always been destined for two. I read it again slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood. But no. The message was clear. Olivia deserved my house because she didn't have a job. Because I did. My chest tightened. My fingers curled around the paper so hard it crinkled. I walked back inside, closed the door, and sat in the middle of my kitchen floor, where the tile was still warm from the morning sun. This house was mine. Mine. Every square inch of it paid for by missed vacations, overnight shifts at Mercy General, and 10 years of saying no to things other people said yes to. I looked around. The oak cabinets I had refinished by hand. The thrifted bar stools I had sanded and painted on weekends. The backsplash I installed while watching online tutorials, cutting my fingers on the glass tiles more times than I could count. None of it had come easy. And now my own parents were saying I should hand it over because Olivia couldn't keep a job. I picked up my phone and stared at their names in my favorites list. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I didn't press it. I didn't know what I'd say. What do you even say to that? It wasn't like this came out of nowhere. There had been tension at the housewarming dinner a few weeks ago. I had invited them all over, proud and hopeful, wanting to show them the place. Olivia had wandered through each room with a blank expression, occasionally making comments like "must be nice" and "all this space for just you." My dad had asked if I had considered renting one room to someone who needed it more. My mom had patted my hand and said gently but firmly that family always makes room for family. I thought it was just passive-aggressive noise. Background judgment. I didn't think they'd turn it into a lawsuit. The door creaked behind me and I turned to see my neighbor Nancy waving from across the fence. "You okay, hon? You look like you saw a ghost." I forced a smile and nodded, then held up the envelope. "Worse," I said. She blinked. "You need anything, you holler." I nodded again and shut the door, my smile gone as fast as it came. My phone buzzed. A text from Olivia. "Let me know when you're ready to do the right thing." No question, no apology. Just entitlement dressed up like morality. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood up, walked into the living room, and stared at the framed photo above the mantel. A picture of my parents, Olivia and me, at my nursing school graduation. I was the first in the family to earn a degree. I had paid for most of it myself. They had clapped and smiled that day. Olivia had joked about how boring it all looked. I had brushed it off. Now I wondered if they were smiling because they were proud of me or because they were relieved they wouldn't have to worry about me anymore. I pulled the photo down and turned it to face the wall. The sun shifted, casting a shadow across the hardwood floor. They were really going to do this. They were going to drag me into court. Over a house I bought. Because I have a job. And Olivia doesn't. It wasn't the lawsuit that hurt most. It was the realization that this had always been coming. Maybe not in the form of court papers, but in the shape of everything that came before it. Growing up in Des Moines, I learned early what was expected of me. I was the responsible one. The one who got straight. As folded laundry without being asked, watched Olivia after school while Mom finished up at the salon. I made dinner a few nights a week by the time I was 12. I learned how to iron Dad's shirts, how to keep Olivia from having a meltdown over the wrong color cereal bowl, and how to swallow disappointment when birthdays or award nights were cut short because Olivia needed attention. They used to say I was so mature for my age, that I was a helper, that I understood things Olivia didn't. And I believed that was something good. I wore it like a badge. Being the solid one. The dependable one. The girl who didn't make waves. Olivia, on the other hand, was described in softer, slipperier terms. Sensitive. Creative. Misunderstood. She had phases. Ballet, horseback, riding, baking, then painting, then marine biology. Every time she quit, my parents chalked it up to finding herself. When she failed a math class, the teacher was too strict. When she skipped school to hang out at the arcade, she was just overstimulated. I once asked at 13 if I could stop piano lessons because I hated them. My mother had stared me down and said quitting wasn't an option. Hartleys don't give up, apparently, unless you're Olivia. Even back then, I understood the double standard. But I made peace with it. Or tried to. I thought maybe if I kept my head down, if I worked hard, and stayed good, they'd see. That one day I'd be noticed, not for being the one who didn't cause trouble, but for being the one who held everything together. I remember one Christmas vividly. I must have been about 16. I had spent hours baking sugar cookies, helping decorate the tree, setting the table just right. I was proud. The house looked beautiful. But when Olivia came down late moody because she didn't like the outfit Mom picked for her, everything shifted. Dad suggested we hold off on dinner until she felt better. Mom sat beside her on the couch, stroking her hair, telling her how beautiful she was. No one even mentioned the cookies. I went to my room and cried into a pillow, telling myself it didn't matter. That it wasn't about me. That at least I was trusted. I had value in a quieter way. I carried that belief like armor for years. Even when Olivia dropped out of college. Even when she bounced from one part-time job to another. Even when she totaled 2 cars and blamed the weather. At every failure, they built cushions for her to land on. Financial help. Excuses. A dozen second chances. Meanwhile, I was filing FAFSA forms on my own, working weekend shifts at a diner through nursing school, and moving into a studio apartment with a leaking faucet and neighbors who played death metal at 3 a.m. The day I graduated from the University of Minnesota's nursing program, I stood on that stage looking for them. I saw them in the back clapping. But Olivia wasn't there. She had forgotten or overslept or something. Mom brushed it off later. Said Olivia had been going through a tough time, that she had felt too overwhelmed to be around crowds. I nodded like always, because that was the pattern. My achievements made them proud, but Olivia's moods dictated the atmosphere. For years I convinced myself I didn't mind. I had my career, my independence. I didn't need the spotlight, but the truth is I wanted them to choose me. Just once. The house was supposed to be that turning point. The moment I proved even to myself that everything I'd worked for meant something. That I wasn't just the reliable daughter, the fallback plan. I was someone who could build something from nothing. someone worthy of space. And now they wanted to rip that away. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a group chat notification. Mom family meeting this Sunday. Hope you'll come, Lauren. Family meeting. Like this was just another weekend debate about where to get takeout. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked into the guest room. The one I had painted a soft sage green. The one Olivia had once offhandedly said was her favorite. I stood in the doorway staring at the bookshelf, the daybed, the desk. All chosen with care, for guests. Not for guilt. Not for her. The anger simmered beneath the surface, not loud, not sharp, just steady, like a current. They had raised me to be strong, then punished me for it. And I wasn't sure what was worse. That I saw it now. Or that I had seen it all along and kept pretending I didn't. Some people inherit homes. Some are gifted them at weddings. I built mine one coupon, one sacrifice, one overtime shift at a time. 12 years as an RN, 5 of those as head nurse at St. Joseph's Medical Center in Omaha. I've worked every major holiday, Christmas Eves, Thanksgivings, even my own birthday. I've stood in supply closets crying between code blues, smiled at families while my back ached, and stayed after my shift so new nurses wouldn't feel alone on their first day. I packed my own lunch every single workday for over a decade. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches. Turkey with mustard, no mayo. Sometimes leftovers in a dented thermos. I skipped takeout, skipped lattes, skipped vacations. I downloaded an app that split my monthly income into 35 categories. Rent, gas, groceries, student loan, emergency, house fund. I stuck to it with the kind of discipline that only comes from desperation and hope holding hands. When interest rates dipped in the spring, I called my mortgage broker the same day. I had enough for the down payment. Not a cent more. The Craftsman on Pine Street had been sitting on the market for months, a little worn around the edges, but it had charm. Crown molding, a front porch with a swing, a small fenced yard, and 3 bedrooms. I still remember the moment the keys touched my palm. It felt heavier than I thought it would. The metal was warm from the broker's hand. I looked at the tiny brass tag dangling from the ring. It had the address engraved on it. My address. I stood in the empty living room, my breath fogging in the spring chill, and whispered, "You did it." That night, I invited my parents and Olivia over for dinner. The house didn't have furniture yet. I had borrowed a folding table from my neighbor across the hall at my old apartment and brought along 4 mismatched chairs. The only things in the kitchen were a slow cooker and a rice cooker. I made chicken and wild rice soup. Simple, filling, warm. Mom arrived first carrying a pie from the grocery store. She made a small sound of approval as she stepped through the doorway, her eyes scanning the baseboards and light fixtures. Dad followed behind her, nodding like he was assessing a real estate investment. "This is nice," he said. "Not bad at all. A little small for the price, maybe." Olivia came last, as always, 20 minutes late, and with nothing in her hands. She wore sunglasses inside, said she had a migraine. I offered her water and she waved it off like it insulted her. We sat around the folding table. I had lit a single candle in the middle to make it feel like more of a celebration. Mom complimented the soup. Dad asked about property taxes. Olivia scrolled her phone under the table until I gently asked her to put it away. After dinner, I gave them a quick tour. The master bedroom faced the backyard, full of golden light even in early evening. I told them how I planned to hang twinkle lights around the window. The second bedroom would be an office once I could afford a desk. The third was just a guest room for now, maybe a reading space someday. Olivia looked around that last room, arms crossed. She raised an eyebrow and said, half joking, I assume, "One person needs 3 bedrooms." I laughed politely. Not a real laugh. Just enough to signal I wouldn't bite. "I like having space," I said. She shrugged. "Must be nice." It wasn't what she said. It was how, like space was a luxury I didn't deserve. Like having something she didn't meant I had taken something from her. Mom stepped in, then trying to smooth things over. "Maybe one day you'll want to start a family. You never know. This will give you room to grow." I nodded, though I didn't buy it. I wasn't thinking about kids or husbands or growing. I had spent so long just trying to have something of my own. A door I could lock, a floor I could mop. A life that didn't depend on keeping the peace at someone else's table. After they left, I sat on the floor with a paper plate and the last scoop of soup. My legs were sore, my arms tired from moving boxes all day. But I felt full. Not just from the food, from the sense that maybe finally I had made it. Now every room in this house feels heavier. Every corner I painted by hand. Every rug I saved up for. Every cabinet handle I replaced on my day off. All of it sits under this new shadow. The idea that Olivia deserves it more. That I should split my home because she's floundering and I've kept afloat. That success is not mine to claim. That stability, once again, is a gift I'm supposed to give away. I stood in that guest room again this morning. The one with the soft sage walls and the thrifted lamp. I looked at the empty bed, the folded quilt, the books stacked neatly on the windowsill. I had meant it as an offering. A place for friends. Maybe one day a niece or a nephew. But not like this. Not because a judge said I had to. Not because my parents filed legal papers that turned a home into a battleground. I sat down on the edge of the bed and ran my hands over the quilt. My fingertips caught on a tiny loose thread. And for the first time since the notice arrived, I didn't feel afraid. I felt tired. But more than that, I felt clear. I had invited them over again. Not out of obligation this time, but because I wanted to believe the weight of that first dinner was a one-off. A blip. Maybe Olivia was tired. Maybe my parents didn't mean to be cold. Maybe if I cooked something a little fancier, opened a bottle of wine, made it feel like an actual celebration, they'd see what this meant to me. I made stuffed shells with ricotta and spinach, roasted vegetables with garlic and thyme, and even baked a loaf of sourdough from scratch the night before. I bought a bottle of Merlot I couldn't really afford. I set the table with real plates this time. The folding chairs were still there, but I'd added cushions. I even put out cloth napkins. They arrived on time. That alone felt like a good sign. Olivia wore a loose cream sweater and jeans that still had the tag attached. She complimented the candlelight and said the house smelled amazing. Mom kissed my cheek and brought a salad. Dad clapped me on the back and said, "This is cozy." We sat. We passed dishes. I poured the wine and lifted my glass ready to toast. That was when Mom spoke. "You know," she said, gently brushing her napkin across her lap, "I've been thinking. You have a lot of space here, honey. Olivia's been struggling, and this place. It could really help her get stable again." I set the glass down without taking a sip. I thought she was just making conversation. I waited for a chuckle, a follow-up, a walk back. Dad chimed in before I could speak. "You've done so well for yourself. It's only fair you share a little. Olivia's between jobs and the rental market is brutal. You've got that extra room just sitting there." I blinked. My mouth was dry. "I bought this house with my own money," I said slowly. "Of course," Sandra said, as if that was beside the point. "We're just saying Olivia needs some help right now. It doesn't have to be permanent." Olivia didn't say anything at first. She just kept her eyes on her plate. Then softly she added, "You've never really understood me, Lauren. You've always been so distant. Like helping me is some big inconvenience." I sat back in my chair. "Distant? I paid your phone bill for 3 years. I helped you rewrite your resume 4 different times. I covered your copay last March. I don't talk about those things because they were gifts, not debts. But don't stand in my kitchen and say I don't care." Gregory exhaled loudly. "That's not the point. The point is Olivia's your sister. Family steps up. You have a responsibility." "To give up my home?" I asked. "No one said give it up," Mom said quickly. "Just a room." "You mean the room I scraped to afford? The room I painted myself? The room I was going to turn into a reading space? The room that was supposed to be mine?" The silence thickened. Olivia's eyes glistened now. Her voice quivered. "I don't have anywhere else," she said. "I've tried, Lauren. I've really tried. It's just, nothing's worked out. And somehow that became my fault. That became my burden." I stood up. Not out of drama. just because I couldn't breathe sitting down. No one moved to help me clear the plates. The food sat half-eaten. The wine untouched. The celebration dissolved into a strategy meeting I never agreed to host. I carried dishes to the sink, ran the water. Tried not to let the clinking sound too sharp. Behind me, Gregory added one more blow. You've always been self-centered, you know. Even as a kid. You hoarded your toys. Now you hoard your success. I laughed then. A short, bitter sound I couldn't hold back. Self-centered, for building a life with no shortcuts. For protecting the only space that was truly mine. For not handing over my stability like a coat at a party. I turned off the faucet. Stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. The candlelight behind me flickered like it was trying to warn me. When I came back to the table, I didn't sit down. Thanks for coming, I said. Mom opened her mouth to say something. I shook my head. Please. Just go. No one argued. They gathered their things. Olivia didn't make eye contact. Gregory walked out first. Sandra paused at the door, her voice low. You're going to regret pushing us away, Lauren. I didn't answer. After they left, I walked back to the table and looked at the wine glasses. 4 of them. Still full. The bottle unopened. The toast never made. I picked up the one I'd poured for myself, stared into the dark red swirl. Then I poured it down the sink. I went to bed with the taste of garlic and regret still on my tongue. I didn't bother brushing my hair, didn't change out of my sweater. Just collapsed into bed and stared at the ceiling while the kitchen clock ticked louder than it ever had. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I got up and pulled out the old planner I kept in my closet. Notebooks full of tracked expenses, payment schedules, little motivational quotes I'd scribbled to myself in the margins. I flipped to the page from 6 years ago, the one labeled dental emergency. I remembered it clearly. A cracked molar that left me crying in the break room at work, clutching my jaw. I had called Mom, then voice shaky, and asked if she and Dad could lend me $700 to cover the root canal. Her response had been quiet but firm. Lauren, honey, do you not have a financial cushion? You're almost 30. You should have something saved for this sort of thing. She hadn't said no outright, just laced the sentence with so much shame that I'd said never mind and hung up. I opened a new credit card that week and paid it off over 7 months. I turned the page to a year later. Olivia Candle Fund. $10,000 sent straight from Dad's account to Olivia's, no questions asked. She had posted about it on Facebook the same day, thanking our parents for believing in her entrepreneurial spirit. She shut the business down 8 weeks later when the wax supplier flaked and she got too overwhelmed to rebrand. They never asked for the money back. No scolding, no probing. Just a pat on the head and a reminder that not everything works out the first time. And then there were the birthdays. I ran a fingertip along the line that read 28th, vanilla cake home. No guests, no decorations. Just a boxed cake with waxy pink frosting and a small envelope of $20 bills. I had thanked them and pretended it didn't sting. Because it was something, and something was better than nothing. Olivia's 30th had been at a rooftop steakhouse in downtown Seattle. They'd flown her in from LA. Booked a private table and posted a photo online of her blowing out candles with a caption that said, "Our shining light." When I'd commented happy birthday, her only reply had been a heart emoji. I pushed the planner aside and sat back on my heels, suddenly aware of how cold the floor was. My knees ached, but not as much as the rest of me. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the parties or the candles or the cake. It was about the story they told themselves. That I was strong, resilient, capable. They used to say it like a compliment. Lauren, you're just built different. You always land on your feet. But what they really meant was that I didn't need. I didn't ask. I could take the hit. So they stopped checking in. Stopped offering. And now, years later, they used that same story to justify handing over my room, my safety, my walls, because Olivia needed. And I didn't. Because I was strong. And strong meant disposable. The next morning, I walked past the kitchen and saw the dishes still in the sink, the empty wine bottle in the trash. It all looked like the aftermath of a party that had never started. I made coffee black, Saturday by the window, and scrolled through old texts. Found one from 4 months ago when Olivia asked if I could review her resume again. I had sent back edits, offered to do a mock interview. She never responded. Another from Sandra asking me if I could help cover Olivia's car insurance for a short while. I had said no kindly. She had replied with silence. And then there was a thread from last week. Mom asking what day the dinner was. Me confirming. Olivia replying with a thumbs up. No one had said thank you. I closed the phone and looked out the window at the patchy grass in the front yard. I had plans to reseed it in the spring. Add a bench. Maybe grow lavender. I thought about the third bedroom. The one with the pale green walls and the bookshelf I had assembled by hand. It wasn't just space. It was possibility. Peace. Maybe some days someone would visit and sleep there. A friend. A partner. Someone who didn't see my boundaries as negotiable. I wasn't selfish. I was just tired of being the landing pad for everyone else's freefall. The coffee had gone cold. I stood up and carried the cup to the sink. Washed it. Then the rest of the dishes. One by one, quietly, carefully. By the time I finished, the sun was higher in the sky and my hands smelled like lemon soap. I dried them on a towel and turned to look at the calendar hanging by the fridge. Just white squares. Empty boxes. Days that hadn't been written yet. And I decided I wasn't going to write anyone else's version of me in them anymore. The envelope was thicker than the last. Certified mail again. I stood in the hallway with it in my hands, the morning sun casting narrow lines across the floorboards, and something in my stomach shifted. Like gravity had pulled just a little harder. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner. I hadn't heard from anyone. No follow-up, no apology, not even a text to ask if the wine had left a stain. I had almost convinced myself that silence meant it was over. It wasn't. I took the envelope to the kitchen table, sliced it open with a butter knife, and pulled out the stack of documents inside. On top was the heading Superior Court of King County. And beneath it in bold blocky font, a phrase that nearly made me laugh if it hadn't been so cruel. Petition to enforce familial understanding. My eyes scanned faster than I could think. The claim was that since 2011 it had been implicitly agreed that I, Lauren Hartley, would provide safe and permanent housing to my sister Olivia Hartley in the event that she could not do so herself. I blinked. Read it again. An understanding. There was more. An itemized appendix of investments made by Gregory and Sandra Hartley for the benefit of Lauren Hartley, beginning with a laptop purchased at Best Buy for $849 in August of 2007, followed by textbooks, dentist visits, Christmas gifts, and a used Honda Civic from sophomore year that I'd sold for scrap 3 years later. Each line had a data dollar amount, and in some cases a description like MacBook for nursing school or prom dress allowance. They had kept a ledger. For over a decade. And now they were calling it debt. I didn't realize my jaw had gone slack until my molars started to ache. I pushed the papers aside and stood pacing the kitchen, then back to the table, then back again. My hands were shaking. A loud knock at the door pulled me out of it. I opened it to find Nancy Bloom standing on my porch in her gardening gloves, her face pale and lips pursed. She held a pair of pruning shears in one hand and looked down at them like she'd forgotten she was holding anything at all. Lauren, I'm sorry to bother you. I just thought you should know. Someone was outside yesterday asking questions. A man. Said he was doing a property evaluation. Not city staff. I asked to see credentials and he left fast. I stared at her. A property evaluation. Nancy nodded. He had a clipboard, took pictures of the siding, the driveway, just looked. Slippery. Thank you, I said, the words hollow and far away. After she left, I called the only person I knew who would understand the paperwork better than I could. Renee Wallace had been my friend Melissa's attorney during her custody battle, and I remembered the way she had spoken in court. Calm. Cold. Surgical. She picked up on the second ring. Bring everything, she said. I'll clear the afternoon. Her office smelled like cedar and coffee. Her assistant handed me a glass of water and a pen, but I didn't touch either. Renee read in silence for 15 minutes. No gasps, no comments, just the scratch of her red pen making notes in the margins. When she was done, she folded her hands and looked at me like she was trying to soften the edges of the truth. They don't see you as a person, Lauren. They see you as a return on investment. Something they once paid into and are now trying to cash out. I felt heat rush up into my cheeks. I didn't know whether it was shame or rage. They're my parents. She nodded slowly. And that makes it harder to swallow. But you need to understand how they framed this. This is not a cry for help. It's a claim of entitlement. And that makes it dangerous. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath me. Something inside me began to fracture, not like glass, but like old tree bark peeling after years of weather. It had been there the whole time, I just hadn't seen it. They didn't love me because of who I was. They tolerated me because of what I did. And now that I refused to do more, they called it betrayal. She slid the papers back toward me. We'll respond formally. I'll handle that. But in the meantime, you need to get your house documents in order. Title, mortgage, anything that proves sole ownership. If they're trying to build a narrative, we're going to burn it down with facts. I nodded, then hesitated. Renee, do you think they'd actually try to take it? She looked at me without blinking. If they think they can profit from it, yes. I thanked her and left the office feeling like the air had thickened. The city street felt too loud. Every passing car like a crash, every voice like a threat. At home, I dug through my file drawer and pulled out the documents. Deed, closing statements, receipts for repairs. I had paid for it all. Every last cent. I stared at the papers spread across my dining table. Proof that I existed. That I worked. That I built something. And now I had to defend it. Not from strangers, but from the people who raised me. The sun dipped low. A breeze crept in through the cracked window, rustling the edges of the court papers. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft sound of it. Then I picked up a highlighter and began marking everything I would need. By the end of that week, my hands had started trembling at work. It was subtle at first. A chart misfiled here, a note I forgot to sign. But in the ER where seconds matter and records are sacred, even small slips ring loud. On Thursday afternoon, Jordan called me into his office. He didn't offer me a chair. Just stood by the window with his arms crossed, face drawn tight. Lauren, we've had 3 separate charting errors flagged under your login this week. One was time-stamped during a med administration. I swallowed hard. I corrected it the moment I saw. It didn't affect care. He turned his eyes tired. I know. And I believe you didn't mean harm. But this is emergency medicine. We can't afford distractions. I'm moving you to triage rotation until further notice. The words landed like concrete. Triage. That wasn't a shift, it was a bench. A message. I nodded because it was all I could do. I walked out past the nurse's station, past the family waiting room, out to my car where I sat with both hands on the wheel for 10 full minutes before starting the engine. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't clean. I left the court papers on the table and crawled into bed, still wearing my scrubs. The silence in the house felt sharper than noise. In the morning, I couldn't bring myself to check the mailbox. It had become a threat. A daily reminder that everything could still get worse. By Saturday, I hadn't answered a single text. Ellen showed up anyway. She knocked once, then let herself in with the spare key I forgot I gave her last Christmas. You look like you haven't breathed since Tuesday. I sat on the couch and tried to smile. It's been a week. She tossed me a hoodie from the back of a chair. Get dressed, we're going walking. And no, I'm not asking. I didn't argue. We walked down toward Green Lake, the air crisp, the trail nearly empty. I kept my eyes on the gravel path while she talked until her tone shifted from light to something else. Did I ever tell you my dad used my name to open a credit card? I blinked, caught off guard. I was 20. First year of college. I found out when I got denied for a student loan. Turns out he had racked up almost $5,000 in cable bills and bar tabs, said it was a family emergency. He laughed when I cried. That's insane. No, it's called family. They guilt you into silence. They call it loyalty. Love even. But it's just control. And when you finally draw a line, they act like you set the house on fire. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. She nudged my shoulder gently. You're not crazy for protecting what's yours, Lauren. The words sank deeper than I expected. I stared out at the water, the slow shimmer under morning light. It looked peaceful. Everything did until you got too close. We walked back in silence, and when we reached my street, Ellen pulled out her phone. By the way, your mom's been posting in that Hartley Cousins group again. You wanna see? I hesitated. Then nodded. She handed me the screen. Sandra Hartley. It breaks our hearts that Lauren has pushed her own sister out of a home we helped her buy. She's not the daughter we raised. Please pray for Olivia as she faces this betrayal. My mouth went dry. They were rewriting the narrative in real time. And everyone was watching. I handed the phone back, my chest burning. She doesn't even believe this. She's lying. Ellen looked at me sideways. She's not trying to convince herself. She's trying to convince everyone else before you can speak. When she left that afternoon, I sat on the porch steps and watched the sky turn pale. A neighbor's wind chime danced in the breeze. Across the street, a child was drawing on the sidewalk with blue chalk. Normal life still moving. Still breathing. Mine felt like it was stuck in a vice. That evening I forced myself to check the mailbox. Inside was a single envelope. I recognized the return address. Renee Wallace. I took it inside and opened it carefully. Her letter was brief. Clinical. Enclosed a draft of our formal response to the petition. Reviewed and ready for your signature. At the bottom she had underlined one sentence: their perception of entitlement does not entitle them to possession. I ran my thumb across the ink like it might make it more true. Then I signed it. Folded it. Sealed it. The next day I mailed it. And waited. 3 days after I mailed the documents, Renee called. Her voice was flat measured, but I could hear something behind it. A tightness. I've come across something troubling, she said. We need to talk. In person if possible. I met her at her office in downtown Everett, a small brick building tucked between a law firm and a bakery. Renee didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a folder across the desk. These are public records. I pulled them while cross-referencing Olivia's financials. It seems your sister opened a rental lease 2 years ago in Tacoma under your name. She used your social security number. Your date of birth. Everything. I opened the folder. There it was. A lease agreement signed in looping cursive next to a photocopy of my old driver's license. Below that, a credit report flagged for missed payments 3 months in a row. It wasn't just identity theft. It was theft with intent to let the damage sit and rot. I pressed my fingers against my temple. I never even lived in Tacoma. Renee nodded, calm but firm. I know. But the property manager listed you as the tenant on file and unpaid fees have been sold to collections. That's what we're attaching to the countersuit. Fraud. Misrepresentation. Damages. My stomach curled. And my credit score. She hesitated. Then turned her screen toward me. The number glowed like a bruise. It had dropped nearly 100 points since last year. She really did this. I said it more to myself than to Renee. I thought we were just unraveling as a family. But this wasn't neglect or disappointment. This was targeted. Renee sat back, laced her fingers. We can argue malicious intent, especially when paired with what came next. She pulled out another page. A sworn statement. From Nancy Bloom. I didn't know what stunned me more. That Nancy had submitted a statement. Or what it said. Apparently, a few months before filing the lawsuit, Olivia and Sandra stood outside Nancy's fence talking. They didn't know Nancy was tending her tomatoes behind the hedges. Sandra told Olivia, "Just file the petition. Your sister won't say no. She's used to cleaning up after everyone. She's always been the reliable one." My hands went cold, used to cleaning up. The reliable one. It wasn't a compliment, it was a calculation. They knew what strings to pull, what stories to spin. And when they didn't work, they turned the whole thing into a public trial. Renee closed the folder gently. This isn't a property dispute, Lauren. This is institutionalized exploitation. Wrapped in family language. But it's not love. It never was. I left her office with the documents clutched to my chest. The wind outside had picked up scattering leaves across the pavement. I stood by my car, watching them swirl. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. They had trained me for this role since childhood. Be the helper. The fixer. The one who doesn't complain. And now, because I had drawn a line, they were trying to paint me as cruel. I wasn't cruel. I was finally seeing the rules for what they were. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my kitchen table, the countersuit documents in one pile, the lease fraud evidence in another. I read and reread Nancy's statement until the words blurred. I thought about every time my mom had called me mature beyond my years. About the Christmas when Olivia ran up the credit card and I used my bonus to cover it because Dad said she was still learning responsibility. About how no one asked what I needed. Only if I could help. And now they had taken my name. My history, my stability. It didn't feel like family anymore. It felt like a system. One designed to survive on my silence. On Sunday, Ellen dropped off a pie she baked. Blueberry. Still warm. She sat with me as I told her everything Renee found. She didn't flinch, so this is coordinated. Yes, she's not just following your lead, she's betting on your restraint. And your mother gave her the blueprint. I nodded slowly. It all made sense now. Every quiet implication. Every shrug. Every time they said I was overreacting when I raised concerns. They weren't confused. They were strategic. Later that night, I walked to the living room and pulled an old photo album from the shelf. One from when we were kids. I flipped through the pages, slowly stopping at a picture of Olivia and me on our bikes. I was 9. She was 6. My knee was scraped, her smile wide. Even then, I remembered I was the one who turned around when she fell. The one who patched her up when no one else looked. Now she was holding the knife and smiling just the same. I closed the album gently and placed it face down on the table. There was no comfort in memory, only pattern. Court was set for 10 a.m. But I was in the hallway outside by 8:30. Renee met me by the elevator, a binder under one arm, her expression unreadable but calm. She asked if I'd had breakfast. I hadn't. We walked inside together. The courtroom smelled like old wood and sanitizer. The benches were nearly empty except for 2 older women in the back, a man in a sports coat who looked lost and Olivia seated to the right with Gregory and our mother. Sandra wore her Sunday pearls hair sprayed into its usual helmet. She didn't look at me, neither did Olivia. Judge Fallon entered at 10 sharp. A woman in her late 60s with silver gray hair twisted into a bun and a voice that could cut steel. She nodded at both counsels and asked if we were ready to proceed. Gregory stood first. His tie was crooked. He launched into a narrative I had grown far too used to hearing. My client Olivia Carmichael has been unemployed for the past 15 months due to health concerns and family hardship. She has been staying at her mother's residence temporarily but now finds herself displaced. Miss Lauren Blake, her older sister, owns a secondary residence and has refused to provide shelter despite prior agreements. He gestured toward me. In cases like these, Your Honor, where one party has significant resources and the other is vulnerable, it falls within the court's power to uphold familial duty. The question here is not just property, it is principle. Who protects whom when family fails? Then he sat satisfied with his display of moral outrage. Renee didn't blink. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked calmly to the center. Your Honor, we are not here to discuss principles in abstraction. We are here to examine actions. Miss Blake is the sole legal owner of the property in question. There is no written agreement obligating her to house Ms. Carmichael, nor has there been any financial exchange or contract. She opened her folder and held up a page. Here is the deed. Here are the bank statements. Here is the deposit receipt. She handed copies to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. But more importantly, Your Honor, we have reason to believe, Miss Carmichael engaged in identity fraud by using Miss Blake's personal information to lease a separate property in 2022. We have documented proof and submitted it for the court's review. A murmur rippled across the room. Sandra whispered something into Gregory's ear, but he didn't move. Renee turned to Olivia. Miss Carmichael, can you explain why your sister's social security number appears on this rental lease in Tacoma? Olivia blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked toward Gregory, but he gave no signal. I didn't know about that, she said too softly. Renee stepped back. We'll come back to that. Then she called her next witness. Nancy Bloom. Nancy took the stand with quiet confidence. She wore a navy cardigan and loafers, her white hair pulled back in a simple braid. She swore and then looked straight at the judge as she spoke. About a year ago, I was in my garden when I heard Sandra and Olivia talking by my fence. They were discussing how to file something against Lauren. The mother said, just file the paperwork. Your sister won't say no. She's always taken care of you. Always has, always will. There was no mistaking her tone. It wasn't a hope, it was a plan. Nancy glanced at me before stepping down. Her eyes were kind. The silence that followed was thick. Even Judge Fallon took a moment before speaking. Does the plaintiff have anything further to add? Gregory stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Miss Carmichael would like to speak. Olivia walked to the witness stand, shoulders slightly hunched. When she spoke, her voice had that rehearsed softness I'd heard before. The one that made people lean in. I know I've made mistakes, she began. But I also know what my sister promised me growing up. She said I would never be without a place to land. That no matter what happened, I would always have a room. I held on to that. I've waited a decade for it. The courtroom was quiet. Even Sandra had gone still. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I was just counting on love. Renee leaned toward me and whispered, watch this. Then she stood again. Miss Carmichael, were you aware of this letter? She held up an envelope. Olivia froze. This is a notice from the Tacoma rental company dated March of last year addressed to Lauren Blake, demanding overdue payments. Did you send this? Olivia's eyes welled. She looked down. I don't remember. Renee raised an eyebrow. Let me rephrase. Did you ever use your sister's name to obtain housing or credit? There was no answer. Judge Fallon finally spoke. Miss Carmichael, perjury carries consequences. I suggest you answer clearly. Still nothing. Just the sound of her shaky breath. Renee turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense rests. The judge looked over the papers again, her face revealed nothing. But she didn't call for recess. Instead, she leaned slightly forward. I will review all evidence thoroughly. A ruling will be delivered within the week. Until then, neither party is to make further contact. Gavel down. Session adjourned. As I stood to leave, I caught Olivia's eyes. They were wet but sharp. Like she wasn't done. Like this was just another delay in a game she still thought she could win. But I didn't feel afraid, not anymore. Outside, the air smelled like rain. Renee walked beside me, silent for half a block. Then she said, that went better than I expected. I nodded, though the weight in my chest didn't lift. We crossed the street. My boots hit the curb. And for the first time since all this began, I didn't look back. 2 days later, I filed the countersuit. Renee walked me through every detail. Fraud. Emotional distress. Financial damages. Misuse of identity. She said it calmly, like listing ingredients for a recipe. I just nodded and signed where she told me. The evidence was stacked high now. What changed everything was a single wire transfer. $25,000 from Gregory's personal account sent to Olivia the day before she filed the original lawsuit. Renee flagged it while cross-checking the dates. I hadn't even thought to look. She slid the printout across the table. He paid her to do it. I stared at the numbers. My name sat in the memo field of the transfer, cold and sharp. We filed the motion that same afternoon. The clerk barely looked up as he stamped it and added it to the docket. By the time the next hearing rolled around, Judge Fallon had been reassigned to a federal case. Her replacement, Judge Atkins, was new to family court. Younger, blunt, wore rimless glasses, and didn't tolerate theatrics. I was fine with that. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers. Gregory's jaw was tight. Sandra looked smaller than I remembered, like someone had deflated her spine. Olivia sat beside her, wringing a tissue in her hands. She didn't look at me. Renee stood straight-backed and focused. Your Honor, in response to the plaintiff's petition, we submit a formal countersuit based on fraud, emotional and financial damages, and identity theft. We present a series of bank statements and witness affidavits corroborating that Mr. Gregory Lane provided Miss Olivia Carmichael with funds in direct correlation with her filing. The implication is clear. This was not about need, it was retaliation orchestrated and funded. She handed over the documents. Judge Atkins flipped through them with the speed of someone who reads case law for breakfast. Mr. Skase, Lane, can you speak to this transfer? Gregory cleared his throat. I lent her money. Olivia needed help. The judge raised an eyebrow. The day before she filed the suit, Gregory hesitated. Timing was coincidental. Renee didn't flinch. Your Honor, we also present written communications between Miss Carmichael and Mr. Lane that suggest premeditated coordination. She handed over screenshots of emails and text exchanges. Some were vague. Some weren't. One had Gregory writing, "Make sure you include the part about her withholding a shared promise." That always lands well in court. Sandra bowed her head. Olivia shifted in her seat and wiped her eyes. Judge Atkins scanned a few lines, then looked up. Miss Carmichael, do you contest this timeline? Olivia's voice cracked. I didn't want to do this. I was just desperate. Did you falsify your sister's information on a rental application? She blinked quickly, looked at her lap, then nodded. Yes. And did you accept money from Mr. Lane with the understanding that you would pursue legal action? Olivia's hands trembled. Yes. The room was still. Judge Atkins turned to Gregory. You are an officer of the court. You know better. Gregory said nothing. Sandra finally spoke. Her voice was brittle. I never wanted it to get this far. I stood up. With all due respect, that's not true. The judge motioned for me to sit, but I kept my eyes on my mother. You watched this happen. You encouraged it. And now you're embarrassed, not sorry. Sandra looked like she'd swallowed glass. The judge banged the gavel once. This is not a forum for family drama. The court recognizes new filings and evidence. A full hearing is scheduled in 2 weeks. Until then, both parties are expected to maintain legal distance. We exited quietly. Outside, the light had shifted. It was bright but sharp, the kind that made you squint even with sunglasses. Renee asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. I told her I needed air. As I crossed the plaza, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. Lauren. Her voice was tentative, but I stopped anyway. Sandra stood just a few feet away, holding her purse like it was armor. You know I didn't want to hurt you. I faced her fully for the first time in weeks. Then why did you? She looked stunned, like she hadn't expected a question. You always say you didn't want things to go this far, I said. But you never stopped them from going there. I took a step closer. That's not absence, that's consent. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't shaking, I was just done. I turned and walked away before she could respond. Later that night, I sat in my apartment with all the lights off. Just me, a glass of water, and the soft hum of the city outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself to anyone. I didn't retaliate, I just stopped apologizing for protecting myself. The morning of the final hearing was quiet, not dramatic. No rain, no thunder, no cinematic clouds. Just the dull gray of Sacramento sky and the sound of my car heater clicking on. I didn't dress for war this time, no power blazer. No heels designed to make a statement. I wore dark jeans, a soft navy sweater, and boots that didn't make a sound when I walked. I wasn't there to perform anymore. Just to close the chapter. Renee met me on the courthouse steps. She was holding a folder, but barely glanced at it. They're not contesting the motion. Olivia's attorney called this morning. They're withdrawing their original claim and not disputing your counter. I nodded. So, it's done. Almost. The judge still has to read it into record. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thinner. Judge Atkins looked at me when I entered, not unkindly, just professionally. Olivia wasn't there. Her seat sat empty beside her lawyer, a stack of untouched documents in front of him. Sandra sat in the back. She wore a long beige coat and didn't make eye contact. Gregory was nowhere in sight. Court is now in session. It didn't take long. Renee stood, confirmed the agreement. Olivia's lawyer confirmed they had no opposition. Then Judge Atkins said the words that landed like both a weight and a lift. The court finds no basis for the original lawsuit. No individual can be compelled to divide privately purchased property solely due to a relative's unemployment or circumstances. Further, the court orders plaintiffs Gregory and Sandra Lane to pay the defendant's legal fees in full. He paused. This case is closed. I exhaled. Not loud. Just enough that I felt it in my ribs. Renee leaned over and whispered, "You did it." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if I had done anything. Or if I had just survived. Outside, the parking lot was half empty. I stood under the awning for a moment, watching a breeze scatter a few dead leaves across the asphalt. Later that day back home, I found 2 messages waiting. The first was an email from Sandra. Short, blunt. Olivia is receiving psychiatric treatment. She won't be returning to court. We thought you should know. I reread it twice, not sure what emotion I was supposed to feel. Relief, guilt. I didn't feel either. Just a slow ache that something had been broken long before this began. The second was a letter, actual paper. Postmarked from Santa Clara. Gregory's handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp angles, dark ink, my name at the top with a comma like he used to write when I brought home report cards. I unfolded it slowly. We were wrong. It started like that. No greeting. Just a sentence. Then another. We were wrong to let it go so far. But once we started, we didn't know how to stop. I thought I was protecting your sister. Maybe even protecting your mother from more pain. But I failed both of you. There was more. He talked about childhood memories, about the house on Hayworth Street, about my graduation day when he forgot the camera and never said sorry. He mentioned the lake house he sold without telling me, said he regretted that the most. And at the end he wrote, I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to hear it. I folded the letter neatly. I didn't burn it. I didn't rip it up or toss it in a drawer. I placed it in a box with other fragments of the past. A dried bouquet from my college pinning ceremony. A postcard from New Orleans Olivia sent before everything went sideways. A photo of the 3 of us at Yellowstone when we still believed family meant something solid. Forgiveness might come. I don't know, but trust. That doesn't return just because someone asks. Weeks passed. Then a month. I went back to work. Took on the night shifts again. The hospital felt steadier than anything else, the routine of vitals and charts and quiet prayers. On one of my days off, I walked to a coffee shop down the block. A barista with a nose ring and silver braids asked my name for the cup. Lauren, I said. She smiled. Good name. You look like a Lauren who's lived through some things. I laughed. Just enough. Yeah, I have. Outside, a mother walked past with her toddler. The little girl tripped and fell, and for a second, the world paused. Then she got up, wiped her own hands, and kept going like nothing happened. I watched them disappear down the block, steam rising from my cup, and realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. Not the numb kind, the earned kind. I had lost a family I spent years trying to hold together. But somewhere along the way, I had stitched myself back into someone I recognized. And this time, I wasn't going to apologize for it. Spring came early that year. By the second week of March, the raised beds in my backyard were already filled with early lettuce, cherry tomatoes, and sprigs of basil that made the air smell like something new was finally allowed to grow. I had help, of course. Mrs. Nancy from next door insisted on showing me how to start seedlings in egg cartons and how to keep squirrels out with coffee grounds. Most afternoons she came over in her big straw hat and gardening gloves that used to be pink before years of digging turned them brown. She talked more to the plants than to me, but when she did speak, it was always something kind. That second week I hosted my first class at the community center. 12 women ranging from age 16 to 70 came for kitchen confidence. We chopped onions together, rolled dough, and talked about recipes passed down and memories we tried not to forget. It wasn't fancy. There were no television cameras or aprons with logos. Just real hands making real food. I taught them my mom's chili recipe but changed it just enough to make it mine. By May I had painted the kitchen. Olive green cabinets with matte black hardware. I didn't ask anyone's opinion. I didn't wait for a mother's nod or a father's frown. I just walked into the store, picked a color I liked, and spent one Saturday with a paintbrush and a playlist full of songs I hadn't listened to since college. That same week, I installed shelves in the living room. Wide wooden ones thick enough to hold every book I had kept even when I had nothing else. There were no second guesses. No need to measure against someone else's expectations. Then there was Daniel. We met at a weekend farmer's market, both reaching for the last jar of lemon marmalade. He smiled, stepped back, and said, "You first." I offered to split it. He laughed and said that was the best deal he'd heard all week. He was a high school history teacher who loved terrible puns, had a chipped front tooth from a middle school skateboarding accident, and was rebuilding after a divorce that left him cautious but open. We went slow. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into walks. Walks turned into silence that felt like home. He never asked about my family. He just asked about me. What books I liked, what made me laugh. What I would cook if I had exactly 23 minutes and nothing in the fridge but cheese and rice. When I told him I owned my home, he didn't raise an eyebrow. He just asked what kind of flowers I wanted in the front yard. One evening after dinner, I pulled out the updated deed. It had my name on it. Just mine. No cosigner, no temporary trustee, no fine print with invisible ink. I framed it. Not to show off. Just to remind myself that sometimes you can fight to keep something and actually win. I hung it by the front door above the small key rack I built from scratch. Every time I walked past it, I didn't feel pride. I felt peace. This was my house, my life. My space where I didn't need permission to belong. I could paint the walls red tomorrow and no one could say a word. I could eat dinner on the floor or invite strangers for soup. I didn't owe anyone proof anymore. One morning I made blueberry muffins for the class. I wrapped a few extras for Mrs. Nancy and one for Daniel. I looked around the kitchen as the light poured in through the window, warming the tile under my feet. I realized then that every room in this house had changed, not because I tore it down, but because I reclaimed it. The living room no longer echoed with memories of arguments or withheld affections. It held laughter now. And book clubs. And early morning yoga on a mat that didn't judge me. The bathroom where I once cried silently after a phone call with Sandra was now a place with lavender candles and a playlist that included Aretha and Adele. Even the hallway, once heavy with the weight of footsteps that came and went with criticism, now smelled like lemon cleaner and hummed with silence that wasn't lonely. Just mine. People ask me sometimes if I still talk to them. I don't. Not because I'm angry. Not because I need an apology. But because healing isn't about circling back. It's about choosing the roads you no longer want to walk again. The past doesn't need to approve my future. It's been 6 months. 6 months since the court said no, since I said no more, since I stopped shrinking to fit someone else's idea of who I should be. I didn't burn bridges, I just stopped building them toward people who tore down mine. And in their place, I built something better. If you've ever been called difficult for daring to protect what's yours, if you've been painted ungrateful for walking away from a family that expected everything but gave you nothing, know this. You're not alone. And you're not wrong. This was my story. Now I'd love to hear yours. If something in this hit home, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes all it takes is knowing someone else has been there too.